Hello, good afternoon everyone. I know this is just after lunch, so it's a bit of a warm-up act. I think you've got a brilliant panel coming up, which I would really recommend you all listen to, because I think it's going to be an important conversation. So I want to a little bit talk about what are the futures we're facing, not the political convenient futures, not the futures that we like to talk about, but actually what the kind of scale of the challenge that we're facing, and thereby what the scale of the response starts to look like. Look, the hard reality is we are already moving to perhaps a future which is at 2.8 to 3 degrees, but if you look at what's happening right now in Iraq, most of the calculations are we're moving towards a 4-degree future. 4-degree future. So we often talk about 1.5 degrees, but we're nowhere close. What does 3-degree futures look like is what they say it means 5 degrees on land and 8 degrees in our urban centers. So 3 degrees is not just 3 degrees flat, it's 8 degrees in our urban cities, which is a massive sea change to what we start to think about our built environments are structured around. And in places like Madrid, we're talking about peak baseline temperatures being 8.5 degrees higher. But what does 8.5 degrees higher mean? Well, it means domestic violence goes up. It means the number of accidents go up in a system. It means cognitive performance of a city goes down by percentage points with every degree temperature rise. It means inequality goes up because energy inequality drives those factors. It means we get greater instability in terms of our supply chains as transformers fail. So what you start to talk about is a much more unstable world in that environment with large forms of inequality. So in that context, but there's also not a linear problem. So how many of you know about the AMOC current, which is a mid-Atlantic current that is actually slowly destabilizing? So if you talk about that, about 4 or 5 years ago, the IPCC would have said it was a 10% chance of it destabilizing. Now we're talking about a significant chance of it is already destabilizing to the effect. What does that really mean? Well, it means for places like the UK, as an example, UK goes from being where it is currently to being -20 to +40 temperatures, right? It's more equivalent to Montreal than what it is right now. Now that's just a temperature range that we're talking about. It also means agriculture in most of the UK becomes non-viable because the hydrological systems no longer work the way they do. They start to become pretty much southeast is the only place you can have agriculture in the UK. So when you start to look at these forms of transformations, they're starting to change the nature of the problem that we're talking about. So when we talk about the built environment, it's really important not just to talk about the input level constraints, but also the transformation of conditions to which our built environment is being built in. If you are building the built environment in the 21st century and you want your assets to be meaningful in the next 10, 20, 50 years, that's what you have to think about. Here's the key thing. Everyone starts to talk about the tipping point when the problems go wrong. So AMOC current destabilizes in 2100. The problem is not that. The problem is when you have the moments of volatility. The volatility in temperature is increasing now and will increase in that period. That is already happening through other forms of frameworks. So when you start to look at the volatility effects, they are much earlier than the endpoint effects. And this is kind of part of the inconvenient truth, part of the conversation that when you talk to city leadership, most city leadership is not looking at the scale of environmental risks that they're holding on behalf of their residents and what that means for regulation and other forms of drivers. So let's use that as an example. But on the input side, you've also got a vast transformation. The reality is most of our targets are nowhere close. We're now facing a cliff that we have to deal with of effectively the transformation of decarbonizing our economy if we're anywhere close. And that excludes, remember, the war machine and the defense machine is off the carbon budget. It is off balance sheet. So anything that you see going on in Iraq with any military is not on the carbon balance sheet of the world, which causes us systemic challenges. So as you keep going, you start to see the massive risks that we're facing on our built environment, but also what you're starting to see is some really interesting innovations going on around the world. Denmark, who you're going to hear from, City of Copenhagen and Denmark, have been extraordinary in leading the way in talking about what the level of decarbonization requirements are. And yet, what we know is today's emission targets are 9.6. We need to get to 0.5. If any of you are a business owner, and if I was to say change 95% of your current value flow, you know your business is dead. Yet every conversation I have is people try to persist in the existing economic model in trying to say, oh, we'll make marginal transitions in this framework. And there is no marginal transitions in this framework. Even the best examples, right? These are some of the best examples. We are nowhere close, right? And it's taking nothing away from these examples. We are nowhere close when we look at the best examples in the world. That means cutting a vast amount of our emissions. And that requires, I think, fundamentally a different approach that is politically difficult to talk about, but essential we start to deal with it. Either we deal with it or we'll be forced to deal with it through energy crisis and other forms of volatility. So, what are the pathways? I think we're going to have to change much more structurally our use of the built environment and the standards and the frameworks of our built environment than what we're currently talking about. One, I think we have to change the way we provide comfort. Our theory of heating a whole building to provide comfort, I think is massively questionable. I think the way we've built comfort and the level of comfort that we've built through built environment and material economics, embodied economics, is just not going to be possible. That requires us to start to reimagine how do we justly, equitably provide comfort in the 21st century. Second, our built environment utilization rates, they're shit. 17% of a school is utilized, 17. Most of our housing stock has been bloating over the last 20 years in terms of size of units and not necessarily the occupancy. We're going to have to massively shift the utilization of our built environment, and I think there is capacity to maybe even double the utilization of cities in our current material stock. That has to be a goal in any viable way forward. Then we're going to have to talk about how we do that. If we're going to invest in the built environment, we're going to have to build and invest in sharing infrastructure. What can you share at the level of a street? What allows our existing built environment stock to be maximized through building shared infrastructure, intergenerational living become possible. And then we're going to have to change all these shared infrastructure typologies all the way through. That is the way we drive efficiency and decarbonization and the material deficits on that. We are going to have to make our built environment stock massively circular, but just to give you an idea, Denmark, which is the best in the developed world, is only 4%. At a 4.2%, I think. Globally, the average is 7.2%. So that's the global average, the global south included. So we are nowhere close to full circularity. And full circularity invites us to think fundamentally differently. Who owns the carbon in a timber house? Who owns the liability of a carbon for 500 years sequestering it? The material economics of all this stuff will become different. Yes, and we're going to have to build a biomaterial economy. That's going to require us to invest in building the biomaterial basis in a fundamentally different way, but recognize how poor our soil conditions are. Again, I could talk a little bit about Denmark because we work there. Actually, the soil conditions, the soil infrastructure is so poor, we're going to have to rebuild our soil infrastructure, rebuild our nutrition base, which is also fragile, to be able to build a biomaterial base. So this is a full system-level transformation required of our biomaterial infrastructure to be able to drive this forward. And so the why I'm saying this is that it's so easy to turn around, and like the UK government has turned around and said the UK is going to build 350,000 homes a year, right? They're not going to deliver it. Nothing against their ambition. It's really important. I know the social justice issues. What level of carbon budget is available for the UK to build that? 14,000 homes a year is what the UK can afford to build if it was to redeploy its carbon budgets. And that does not mean it is able to do any retrofit. We do not have the carbon, material, or labor budgets now effectively to deliver homes in the way of new homes. Yes, we need to deliver new homes, but they're going to have to be done massively through retrofit, massively through improving efficiency of our built environment stock. That is the way we're going to have to do it, and that requires a real level of openness of governments to start to think beyond traditional 20th century industrial policy, build more homes, you create a GDP response, you get the right politics into play. This requires a degree of efficiency that I think is really difficult and requires a new form of politics. Fundamentally, this also sits in a framework where we are starting to see energy shocks are going to remove the capacity for most of our environment to be able to actually fund the material economics as well as the labor economics. So I think what I'm asking for is a real systemic level of pragmatism. Pragmatism which is rooted in understanding the biomaterial risks, understanding the social risk, and not just grandstanding on stages because you can see small political wins which are massively at the loss of future horizons and future generations. This requires a degree of integrity that I think is really vital. Now, as I set this ground, none of this is impossible, right? It's not like we are going to face a whole soil transformation. We are going to move into a circular material economy. We are going to move into an embodied material stewardship economy. These things are going to happen. The question is, are we trying to do them in the right way as well? And this needs to be set in the ground of how do you provide systemic continuity. So, often when you start to look at these futures, people will give you pictures of shiny buildings and new buildings. The problem for us, certainly in the West, is how we retrofit vast amounts of our neighborhoods. And I don't mean just the built environment stock. I mean the neighborhoods in terms of energy continuity, all the way through to ecological continuity, all the way through to retrofit and densification of use, not densification of built environment, all the way through to building the regenerative blue-green infrastructure. Part of the problem is we do not know how to value our blue-green infrastructure, which will cool a neighborhood by 3 to 4 degrees, reduce energy dependency, all sorts of other issues. We are not starting to think deeply about those infrastructure gains. And I think it's absolutely critical that we start to code for a different climate zone. If you're not doing that and the volatility of that, I think that is a real risk that we're holding. And when you, especially if you're building new built environment, what does that look like is really vital. So, as we go into this, what I want to say is that what we're learning, what I've just described as the problem space. And everyone kind of goes, okay, this is great. But how do you actually deliver it is, I think, not the same way. And I'm going to put some ideas down just for how do you finance this stuff? How do you structure this stuff? And I think the problem is in the structuring and the organizing. So one of the biggest problems we face is there is no level of neighborhood asset management. Neighborhood level asset management does not exist. So we're forced to asset management at the level of the individual or at the level of the municipality. If we were to try to build neighborhood level asset management vehicles, combinatorial risks, we start to be able to construct the means to be able to borrow and manage these risks. So I think we need new types of asset management institutions, which are community-driven asset management institutions, as a means to manage these risks. Second, how do you finance retrofit or any of this work? What's becoming very clear is that households don't have the ability to be able to take on more debt. The horizon of a household right now is 3 to 4 years is their discount rate to effectively want to get their payback. 3 to 4 years. Even if you put solar panel, it's still 7 to 8 years. So what we have is a problem that households are too fragile to be able to create the cost of actually doing the transition. That means what we have to do, and I think one of the big things we've been exploring is how do you turn the energy meter or the water meter into a digital trust and finance against the trust on the service costs. So you move it away from household-based finance to actually use intermediary financing or real estate financing as a means to be able to do that infrastructure. So the tricks are not in descriptions of what we need to do. It's my big question here is we know what we need to do, we just don't seem to be able to structure it. So all the way through, obligated material registries. We know if you build a carbon house, you have a responsibility to store that carbon for 500 years. We don't have the material economies to be able to create those liabilities and manage them. All the way through standards. We're talking to one local authority in the UK that's starting to talk about what are the new material standards required, what are the new environmental standards required with regards to those risks. So I think there is a new economy of built environment deeply possible, deeply necessary, and at the same time, I think it opens up a demand for a different way of thinking. If we don't do this also, I want to be clear, the economics are fundamentally different to the marginal cost gain conversations we end up with. So let me give you an example. And this is a catastrophic example, but I want you to understand this. If we lose the Antarctica, which is currently where we're headed, by the way, we're talking about 65-meter rise with Greenland of water levels. What is the total value at risk just for London in residential terms? Let me give you the number. There are 3.8 million homes. The average price of the home is $668,000, which means the total value at risk for London is about 2.52 trillion just on the basis of housing value. We're going to have to think fundamentally differently about the risks that we face, how we price those risks, and how we mobilize them. And this is going to require governments and private sector actors to come together in an unprecedented way. It's very clear, if you saw the biodiversity report recently from the UK government, that biodiversity is fundamentally linked right now to financial stability. That is a central banking issue at the core level. When we start to think about these things, we're moving into a new economic theory to deliver the sorts of transitions that we require, and that's going to require governments and private developers and other actors to work fundamentally differently on the provision of security and stability. I'll thank you with that. Thank you for this. The panel will be great. Thank you.